My husband cried at my bedside the night the doctors told him I might not have long. He held my hand. He kissed my forehead. He told me I was the love of his life. And every single word of it was a lie. Because here's what I know now. What took me 2 years, a hidden recorder, and one very suspicious folder on a laptop to figure out. He wasn't crying out of grief. He was crying because I woke up. Let me take you back to the beginning, because this story doesn't start with betrayal. It starts with love. Or what I thought was love. My name is Sarah. I'm 42 years old. I lived, in a beautiful colonial house in a quiet suburb outside of Portland, Oregon. The kind of neighborhood where people wave from their driveways and bring each other banana bread when someone's sick. The kind of place that feels safe. Or the kind of place where you lower your guard. I married Daniel when I was 28 years old. He was 31. Handsome in that quiet, serious way. Dark hair, strong jaw, always reading something. He was a financial advisor, methodical, careful. The kind of man who triple checks the locks at night and files taxes in January. I used to tease him about it. I used to think it was adorable. I work from home as a graphic designer. Mostly brand identities, packaging, the occasional book cover. I loved my job. I loved my life. I had a daughter, Lily, from a brief relationship before Daniel. She was 2 when we got married, so as far as she was concerned, Daniel was dad. She left for college in Boston 2 years ago. The day we dropped her off, I cried the whole 4-hour drive home. Daniel squeezed my hand on the console and told me, "It's okay. Now it's just us." At the time, those words felt romantic. Now they make my skin crawl. Our marriage was, and I want to be honest here, not perfect, but good. Comfortable. We had our routines. Coffee at 7. He left for the office by 8. I worked until 3, went for a walk, started dinner. Fridays we watched movies. Sundays we cooked together. Nothing glamorous. But it was mine. It was ours. I had a best friend named Claire. We'd been close since college, 20 years of friendship. She lived 12 minutes away. We had standing lunch dates every Thursday. She was the person I called when Lily had her first heartbreak, when my mother was diagnosed with cancer, when my father passed away 2 years after that. Claire knew everything about me, or so I thought. My parents' death hit me hard, harder than I expected. My mother went first, ovarian cancer, quick and brutal. My father followed 11 months later. Heart failure, but I always believed it was grief. They were that kind of couple. The doctor said he just stopped. Some people do that. Some people love someone so completely that when they leave, there's simply no point in continuing. I inherited everything. My parents weren't wealthy in an extravagant sense, but they'd been smart. A paid-off house they'd sold years prior, savings, investments accumulated over 40 years of careful living. By the time the estate was settled, I had a trust fund worth $3.2 million. Daniel handled the paperwork. He was a financial advisor, after all. It made sense. I trusted him completely. That was my first mistake. The second mistake. I ignored the signs that something was wrong with me, or, as I now know, something was being done to me. It started small. So small I almost didn't notice. I forgot where I put my keys. More than usual, I lost words mid-sentence sometimes, reaching for them like they were on the tip of my tongue. But the tongue was suddenly numb. I'd walk into a room and have absolutely no idea why I'd gone there. Daniel would mention conversations we'd had that I had no memory of, appointments I'd apparently scheduled and forgotten. I once couldn't remember what I'd had for breakfast, even though it was only 11 in the morning. I mentioned it to Daniel. He looked at me with such tender concern. He pulled me close and said, "Sarah, you've been under a lot of stress. Losing both your parents so close together, it takes a toll, sweetheart, on the body and the mind." And I believed him, because of course I did. But then things got worse. It was a Tuesday in February, one of those gray, wet Pacific Northwest days where the sky looks like a dirty sheet. Daniel had left for work. I had a client call at 9. I sat down at my desk, opened my laptop, and realized I'd forgotten to email a logo proof to a client the night before, something I was completely certain I had done. I had a clear memory of clicking send. I checked my sent folder. Nothing. I checked drafts. Nothing. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the screen. The memory was so vivid. The exact font I'd used in the email, the way I'd typed, "Please let me know your thoughts," and then deleted thoughts and replaced it with feedback. Details. Real, specific details. How do you remember something that never happened? I pushed it aside and resent the email. I apologized to the client. I told myself it was stress, grief, age. That was February. By April, the lapses were happening weekly. Daniel suggested I see a doctor. I hesitated. I've always been healthy, rarely sick. And there's something deeply frightening about walking into a doctor's office and saying, "I think something is wrong with my brain." It feels like opening a door you can't close again. But Daniel encouraged me. Gently. Patiently. The way you'd encourage a child who's afraid of the dark. He found a specialist for me, a neurologist named Dr. Marcus Webb, whose office was 40 minutes away, but came highly recommended. Daniel had, apparently, done extensive research. The first appointment was in May. Doctor. Webb was in his early 50s, silver at the temples, warm handshake, warm smile, the kind of doctor who maintains eye contact and nods a lot so you feel heard. I liked him immediately. He ran tests, memory assessments, cognitive evaluations, blood work. He was thorough and kind, and when we sat down to discuss results 3 weeks later, he was grave. "Sarah," he said, leaning forward, "the pattern of what you're experiencing is consistent with early onset cognitive decline. We're not talking about full dementia, not yet, but the trajectory concerns me." I remember the exact temperature of the room, the faint smell of coffee from somewhere down the hall, the way my hands felt too heavy in my lap. "How concerned?" I asked. "Concerned enough that I'd like to start you on a medication protocol immediately. And I'd like to see you monthly." I drove home in a fog. Daniel was waiting for me. He'd left work early. He'd made tea. He sat with me at the kitchen table and held both my hands while I told him what Dr. Webb had said. His face. God, his face. It was a perfect portrait of a loving husband receiving devastating news. Eyes glistening, jaw tight, squeezing my fingers. "We'll get through this," he said. "Together. Whatever it takes." I started the medication that night, and here's where everything begins to unspool, because 2 months later I was worse. The lapses were more frequent. I started having confusion about dates, times. I once couldn't remember my daughter's middle name for a full, terrifying minute. I called Claire crying. I called Daniel at work crying. Dr. Webb adjusted my medication. Upward, more doses. And I got worse still. But nobody seemed alarmed by the fact that I kept getting worse despite the treatment. Nobody said, "Maybe the treatment isn't working." Nobody said, "Maybe we should try something different." Nobody said anything except, "Sarah, you have to accept that this is the nature of the illness." I accepted it, because what else do you do? Then came the afternoon that changed everything. It was a Sunday. Daniel was at the grocery store. I was looking for a charger, the one I use for my drawing tablet, and I couldn't find it anywhere. I checked the home office, which was technically Daniel's office, but he kept a spare charger in the desk drawer. I'd borrowed it before, plenty of times. I opened the bottom drawer, no charger, but there was a laptop. Not his work laptop. Not the personal laptop he kept on the desk. This was a third one, slim, black, a model I didn't recognize. I would have dismissed it entirely. Maybe it was a client's. Maybe it was old. Except for one thing. It wasn't in a case. It wasn't stored away. It was just sitting there, slightly open, like it had recently been used. I told myself it was nothing. I almost shut the drawer. Almost. I don't know what made me pick it up. Call it instinct. Call it whatever that low animal frequency is that hums in your chest when something is wrong, before your brain can articulate why. I opened it. It wasn't password protected, and the last thing that had been open on it was a folder. A folder labeled Sarah, archived. I want you to understand what that moment felt like. You know that sensation when you're walking down a staircase in the dark and you think there's one more step, and there isn't? That stomach dropping, ground disappearing feeling? That's what it was. Except it lasted for the next 2 years of my life. I sat down on the office floor with the laptop in my hands, my back against the desk, the house completely quiet. I opened the folder. There were hundreds of files inside, neatly organized, meticulously sorted into subfolders. The subfolders had dates on them going back, and I had to blink to make sure I was reading this correctly. Almost 3 years. 3 years. I clicked on the earliest subfolder, October, 3 years ago. Inside were audio files, dozens of them. My hands were shaking when I double-clicked the first one. The audio was low quality but perfectly audible, and I recognized the voice immediately. It was mine. Talking. I was talking about my mother's illness, about how scared I was, about the guilt of not being there enough in her final weeks. I was talking to my therapist. At the time, I'd been seeing a therapist named Dr. Ann Reeves, completely separate from Dr. Webb. Different building, different specialty. She was a psychologist, not a neurologist. I'd started seeing her after Mom's diagnosis, just to process the grief. I'd seen her for about 1.5 years. These were recordings of my sessions with Dr. Reeves. Private, confidential, legally protected therapy sessions. Someone had been recording them. I sat there on the floor for a very long time, not moving, just listening. My own voice spilling out of the speaker, raw and unguarded, saying things I had only ever said inside that therapy room, things I'd never told Daniel, things I'd never even told Claire, and someone had recorded all of it. I didn't hear Daniel's car pull into the driveway until it was almost too late. I closed the laptop, put it back exactly where I found it, got up, went to the kitchen, and was standing at the counter when he came through the door with grocery bags, asking if I wanted pasta or chicken for dinner. I said chicken. I don't know how I said it so normally. To this day, I don't know. That night, lying in the dark beside my sleeping husband, I made myself a promise. I would not panic. I would not confront. I would not tip my hand. Because here is what being gaslight for 2 years teaches you, even before you know it's happening. It teaches you not to trust your own reactions. It teaches you to second-guess yourself before you've even finished a thought. So my first instinct, to shake Daniel awake and demand an explanation, died before it could fully form. Instead, I thought, get evidence first. Then think. So that's what I did. Over the next 3 days, I found windows when Daniel was at work or running errands, and I went back to that laptop. Carefully, methodically, one subfolder at a time. And I want to tell you what I found, slowly, because I need you to understand how each discovery felt like the floor dropping 1 more inch beneath my feet. Discovery 1. The audio files weren't just from my sessions with Dr. Reeves. They were also from inside my home. Conversations I'd had on the phone, conversations with Claire, a long private call with Lily the Christmas before she left for college, where she cried and told me she was terrified of leaving home. And I told her the things a mother tells a daughter in those moments, the most tender, private things. Recorded. filed, archived. How? I had no idea yet, but I started looking at everything in our house differently. Every object, every corner, every smoke detector, every book on the shelf. I found it 4 days later. A small, flat listening device tucked inside the smoke detector in the living room, almost invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. And I only found it because I dragged a chair over and inspected every detector in the house with a flashlight. There were 3 of them: living room, kitchen, home office. I left them exactly in place. Discovery 2. I went back to the laptop with more purpose now. I wasn't just browsing, I was hunting. In a subfolder labeled Medical, I found documents. These weren't recordings, these were text files, emails, and they were between Daniel and Dr. Marcus Webb, my neurologist, except they weren't discussing my condition the way a doctor discusses a patient's condition with a concerned spouse. They were discussing strategy. I'm going to read you some of what I found because the language matters. One email from Daniel to Dr. Webb, dated 8 months before my first appointment, said, "She's inherited the full amount. Trust is structured as I expected, joint management, but sole authority requires competency designation. We need the evaluation to support the diagnosis. Timeline is important. She needs to be at stage 2 minimum by the 18-month mark. Is that achievable with the current protocol?" Stage 2. Protocol. The current protocol. He wasn't asking about my medical care. He was asking about a schedule. Dr. Webb's reply was 3 sentences. I've memorized them. Achievable, but requires consistent administration. She cannot know what she's taking. The cognitive effects are cumulative. The longer the protocol runs, the more pronounced and credible the decline. She cannot know what she's taking. I read that line at least 15 times before my vision stopped blurring. I need to pause here and tell you something, because I want you to feel the full weight of this moment. I was a healthy woman. There was nothing wrong with my brain. The memory lapses, the confusion, the fog that had been wrapping itself around my mind for 2 years. None of it was illness. None of it was grief or stress or early onset anything. It was the pills I had been faithfully taking every morning and every night for 2 years, prescribed by a doctor who was conspiring with my husband to make me lose my mind. Let that sit for a second. My husband had found a corrupt doctor willing to participate in slowly poisoning me, not fatally, just cognitively, so that he could have me declared legally incompetent and take control of my $3.2 million trust fund. He had been planning this for years. And the worst part, the part that made me press my hand over my mouth and breathe through my nose and make myself stay calm, was that I still didn't know how deep this went, because I hadn't opened all the folders yet. Discovery 3. There was a subfolder I'd been avoiding because the name made no sense to me. I can't describe what it felt like to open that one. Claire had been my best friend for 20 years. She'd held my hand at both my parents' funerals. She'd been the first person I called when I got engaged to Daniel. She'd thrown my baby shower when I was pregnant with Lily. 20 years. More than half my life. The subfolder contained a series of emails and 2 voice memos. The emails were between Daniel and Claire. The first one was dated 14 months ago, and they weren't the emails of a man communicating with his wife's best friend. They were the emails of 2 people managing a shared project. "She's asking questions again," Claire wrote in one. "I told her it was normal progression. She seemed to accept it. But she's sharp, Daniel, sharper than Webb thinks." Daniel's reply: "Keep her focused on the grief angle. She's more likely to accept cognitive decline if she connects it emotionally to losing her parents. Don't push back too hard when she doubts herself. Let her reach the conclusion on her own. Let her reach the conclusion on her own." My best friend. For a year, my best friend had been gently, carefully, lovingly guiding me toward believing I was losing my mind. Every time I'd called her crying, every time she'd come over and made tea and held my hand and said, "Oh, Sarah, I've noticed it too, but I didn't want to worry you." Every single time. She'd been playing a role she'd been coached to play. I closed the laptop and sat in the dark office for a long time. I thought about the last 20 years. And then I thought about the voice memos. I almost didn't listen to them. A part of me thought, what else could there possibly be? How much worse can this get? But I'd come this far. The first voice memo was a phone call between Daniel and Claire, recent, just 2 months ago. I'm going to tell you what they said, but I need you to understand. Hearing this in real time, in the actual voices of people I loved, was a different experience entirely from reading words on a screen. It bypassed my rational mind completely and went straight to something deeper, something primal. Daniel's voice. The evaluation is scheduled for next month. Webb is confident he can support a formal incompetency determination. Once that's filed with the court, I have full authority over the trust. 6 to 8 weeks, Claire. Claire's voice. Quiet, and this is the part that gutted me. She sounded tired. Not guilty, not horrified. Tired, like they were discussing a project running behind schedule. And after? What happens to Sarah? A pause. Daniel. She'll be moved into a care facility. I've already looked at options. It's the most compassionate choice given her condition. Claire. Her condition that we created. Another pause. Longer. Daniel. She'll be comfortable, Claire. She won't even fully understand where she is. That was the goal. That was always the goal. Not just my money. Me, erased, filed away in a care facility, too cognitively impaired to fight back, to call Lily, to tell anyone what was happening. A woman with no voice, no agency, no self. Archived, just like the folder. Discovery 4, and this one I almost missed. In the deepest subfolder, tucked under a string of dated files I'd already reviewed, was a single document, an insurance beneficiary update, March. Daniel had taken out a substantial life insurance policy on me, and 4 months ago, he had updated the beneficiary. I won't tell you who he'd updated it to because I need you to keep reading, but I will tell you this. It wasn't Lily. It wasn't a charity. It wasn't anyone I would have expected. And the policy had a clause, a very specific clause about cognitive incapacity and long-term care, which meant that even if I was in a facility unable to make decisions, there was money flowing somewhere. A lot of it. Regularly. Daniel hadn't just planned to take my trust fund. He'd constructed an entire financial architecture around my disappearance from my own life. And everyone around me, my doctor, my best friend, had helped him build it. I need to tell you about the moment I stopped being afraid. Because for weeks after I first found that laptop, I was afraid. Profoundly, physically afraid. I was afraid every time Daniel touched me. Afraid every time he handed me my medication in the little white cup he brought to me each morning. Standing by the bed like such an attentive husband. Afraid every Thursday when Claire came for lunch, laughing and pouring wine and asking how I was feeling, and I had to sit across from her and smile and say, "A little foggy today, but okay." The fear was enormous, but somewhere around week 3, the fear shifted. It didn't disappear. Don't misunderstand me. But something else moved in beside it. Something quieter and colder and far more useful. Anger. I had been stripped of my mind, my memories, my sense of reality, and my trust, by the 3 people I trusted most. They had taken my grief over my parents and weaponized it. They had taken my love for Daniel and used it against me. They had taken my friendship with Claire and turned it into a surveillance operation. I was 42 years old. I was healthy. I was sharp. And they had made me doubt every single one of those things. So I stopped being afraid, and I started building my case. There are things you do when you realize you are alone in a way you have never been before. You get quiet. You get careful. You become a version of yourself that's been stripped down to the bare functional core. Just the parts of you that think clearly and move purposefully. Everything else, all the emotion, the grief, the rage, gets stored away like fine china you can't afford to break right now. Well, that's who I became for the next several weeks. I stopped taking the medication, not immediately. I didn't want Daniel to notice. I'd take the pill, tuck it under my tongue, go to the bathroom and flush it. It took about 11 days before I started to feel something shifting, a clarity, like a window being wiped clean, colors a little brighter, words coming faster. The fog, which I had truly believed was my own failing mind, beginning to lift. I cried the day it fully lifted. Not from sadness, from fury, and from relief so overwhelming it almost knocked me over. I had never been losing my mind. I had been chemically manipulated into believing I was. While I was weaning off the medication without Daniel knowing, I was also doing something else. I was making copies. Every file on that laptop, every email, every audio recording, I transferred it all to a USB drive I'd bought with cash at a drugstore 20 minutes from our neighborhood. I kept the drive in a small zippered pocket inside an old purse in the back of my closet. The purse Daniel had once said he hated, and I should donate. I smiled every time I put the drive in it. I was also keeping a journal, handwritten, in a notebook I kept inside a hollowed-out hardcover book on the lowest shelf of the bookcase in the guest bedroom. I documented every observation, every date, every interaction that felt significant. I started noting what Daniel said to me and when, how he watched me, how he reacted when I mentioned the doctor, the medication, my memory. And I started noticing things I'd missed before, the way his eyes would sharpen whenever I mentioned something specific, like he was checking the validity of my cognition against a baseline he'd been monitoring. The way he'd casually mention Dr. Webb's next appointment, always framed as care. "I scheduled your check-in for Thursday, sweetheart. We don't want to miss it." The way he'd sometimes say, so gently, "You mentioned that already, honey, about 20 minutes ago," even on days when I was certain I hadn't. Even now, off the medication, clearer than I'd been in 2 years, I would catch him doing it. Trying to plant false memories, trying to keep the fiction of my decline alive. He didn't know the window had been wiped clean. He thought he was still managing a woman in the early stages of engineered cognitive collapse. He was managing a woman who was building a case against him. I need to tell you about the Thursday 2 months into my private investigation because that was the day everything inside me cracked open in a way I hadn't allowed it to before. Claire came for lunch. As usual, she brought flowers and ranunculus, my favorite, which she had always known. She stood in my kitchen doorway with those flowers and her warm smile, and something about the absolute normalcy of it. The way she could stand there, having done what she'd done, and smile at me like that, hit me like cold water. I had been telling myself that what Claire did was motivated by something I could someday understand. Money, pressure. Maybe Daniel had something on her. Maybe there was an explanation that would make it survivable. But standing in my kitchen, watching her arrange those flowers in a vase, while she asked me how I was sleeping, I understood. There was no explanation that made this survivable. Not for our friendship. Not for what we'd been. She had watched me fall apart for a year. She had sat across from me while I cried and said, "I've noticed it too, Sarah." And she had known. The whole time she had known. I poured her a glass of wine. I sat across from her. I smiled. And while I smiled, I thought about what I was going to do next. I had been conducting my investigation mostly alone. And it had been, let me be honest, terrifying. But I knew I was going to need help. Real help. Legal, professional help. The kind that comes with authority. I couldn't go to Daniel's friends. I couldn't go to Claire. I couldn't go to Dr. Reeves, my old therapist, because I had no idea how far the web extended. For all I knew, she was involved too. But there was one person I trusted completely. One person who wasn't connected to Daniel's world, who had never met Claire, who had no reason to be compromised. Lily, my daughter. I called her on a Tuesday afternoon, using a burner phone I'd bought at the same drugstore as the USB drive. I stepped out for a walk. I went to the park 3 blocks away and sat on a bench and called her. She picked up on the second ring, the way she always does. "Mom," she said, and I could hear immediately that she knew something was wrong, because mothers and daughters have a frequency between them that nothing else in the world can replicate. "I need to tell you something," I said. "I need you to listen until I'm done, and I need you not to panic. Can you do that?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "Tell me." So I told her everything. I talked for almost an hour. I told her about the laptop, the folder, the emails, the recordings, the medication, the insurance policy. I told her about Claire. I told her about Dr. Webb and the emails discussing the protocol and the timeline, and the word archived. Lily didn't interrupt me, not once. When I finished, there was a long silence, and then she said, very quietly, "Mom, I knew something was wrong. I've been trying to tell you for months." "What do you mean?" "I called the house twice in March when you weren't answering my texts. Both times Daniel picked up and told me you were resting, that you'd had a bad day cognitively and needed quiet, and both times something felt off about it. I mentioned it to a friend who's pre-law, and she said that the way someone is characterized by the people around them before a competency evaluation can significantly influence the outcome. And I thought I was being paranoid. I thought I was just being scared about you." My daughter had been seeing it. From 2,000 miles away, she had been sensing it. "Come home," I said. "I'm booking a flight tonight," she said. Lily arrived on a Thursday, the same day Claire came for lunch. Daniel didn't know she was coming. I hadn't told him, and Lily had come straight from the airport in a cab. She arrived at noon. Claire was still there. I will never forget the look on Claire's face when Lily walked through the door. It was just a flash, a quarter second, but it was unmistakable. Panic. Because Lily wasn't supposed to be here. Lily was in Boston, kept updated by Daniel on her mother's progressive condition, gently being managed just like everyone else. Lily, arriving unannounced, was a variable that hadn't been accounted for. I watched Claire compose herself in real time. It was almost impressive. The smile that replaced the panic was so smooth, so natural. "Lily, oh, what a wonderful surprise!" Lily smiled back, hugged her, and over Claire's shoulder met my eyes. That look between us contained an entire conversation. "I see it," Lily's eyes said. "I see exactly what you see." That evening, after Claire left and Daniel was home, Lily and I sat at the kitchen table while Daniel cooked. And Lily did something that I hadn't thought to do, something that made me realize why I'd needed her here. She asked Daniel, casually, conversationally, while he stood at the stove, "Dad, I've been thinking about Mom's trust fund. Since she's having health issues, is there anything we should be doing to protect it? Like, legally?" She watched him. I watched him. He didn't turn around immediately. There was a beat, half a second maybe, where the stirring stopped, and then he turned with a perfectly calibrated expression of pensive concern. "That's actually something Dr. Webb and I have been discussing," he said. "There are protective measures for situations like this. We'll probably talk about it after the next evaluation. Situations like this. The next evaluation. Everything I had found in that laptop confirmed in 10 seconds live in my kitchen. Lily looked at me. I looked at Lily. We both smiled and said nothing. After Lily arrived, things moved faster. I had someone I could think out loud with, someone I could trust at a molecular level. We spent the evenings after Daniel went to bed going through everything on the USB drive together. Lily had grown up to be frighteningly sharp. She's studying criminology, which felt, in retrospect, like the universe preparing her for exactly this. It was Lily who connected the final piece that I had been circling without being able to name. "Mom," she said one night, sitting cross-legged on the guest bed with the laptop balanced on her knees. "The insurance beneficiary. You said you didn't recognize the name." I nodded. "I looked it up. It's a property management company registered in Oregon. Small. 3 years old." She turned the screen toward me. "One of the directors has the same last name as Dr. Webb's wife." Silence. "It's a shell company," Lily said quietly. "Daniel isn't just paying Webb for the diagnosis. He's paying him with a piece of the payout." I thought about the insurance policy, the trust fund. $3.2 million plus the insurance payout, plus the ongoing management fees Daniel would collect as trustee of my declared incompetent estate. We were talking about somewhere worth of $5 million. $5 million. For that, a doctor had agreed to prescribe me a medication designed not to treat, but to damage. For that, my best friend of 20 years had agreed to monitor and gaslight me. For that, the man who had stood beside me at the altar, who had held my hand at both my parents' funerals, had looked me in the eyes every single day and performed love like it was a stage production. It was all about the money. It had always been about the money. But there was still one question that gnawed at me. One question I couldn't let go of because the answer would tell me exactly how cold-blooded this really was. Had Daniel ever loved me? Or had the plan existed from the beginning? I went back to the earliest files on the laptop, not the ones from 3 years ago, the ones from before that, the ones that predated the folder by another year or more. I hadn't gone back that far before because I'd assumed the folder contained everything. It didn't. There was a separate folder, unlabeled, buried inside a nested directory of system files, the kind of place that screams, "Don't look here," to anyone who knows what to look for, which until Lily I didn't. She found it. And inside it were documents going back almost 6 years. 6 years. Do you understand what that means? When my mother was first diagnosed with cancer, when I was devastated and frightened and leaning on Daniel more than I'd ever leaned on anyone, he had already been planning this for at least a year. When my father died, when I inherited the trust fund, when I signed documents giving Daniel joint management authority because he was my husband and I trusted him. He had been working toward that moment for years. The relationship had been, from some point early in its existence, a long con. How do you make peace with that? How do you hold the truth that the person who knew you most intimately in the world was simultaneously calculating how to erase you? I don't know that you ever fully do, but you can act on it, and that's what I was going to do. Lily and I had spent 3 days quietly consulting with an attorney, a woman named Margaret, who was a friend of Lily's professor and had experience with financial fraud and elder abuse law. We met her twice at her office, never telling Daniel we were going, claiming we were shopping or running errands. Margaret was remarkable, calm, exact, furious on our behalf in a way that never interfered with her precision. She reviewed everything on the USB drive. She brought in a colleague who specialized in pharmaceutical malpractice. She contacted the Oregon Medical Board. Then she told us something that changed the entire shape of what came next. "Dr. Webb isn't the first complaint against him," she said. "There was an incident 3 years ago. A patient, elderly woman, Similar situation. It was settled quietly. There's a pattern here. If we move correctly, we don't just stop what's happening to you. We open an investigation that takes down his entire practice. I thought about that elderly woman. I thought about whether there were others I'd never know about. Move correctly. That was the operative phrase. Because here's what Margaret explained. If I confronted Daniel before we had everything in order, he could move money. He could destroy evidence. He could, and this is what kept me up at night, hurt me. Not physically, maybe, but in 100 other ways. He could accelerate the competency evaluation. He could have me involuntarily hospitalized under the guise of a crisis episode. He could do all of this before I had legal protection in place, and I would have no recourse. So we did not move until we were ready. We took 12 days to be ready. On 12 days of smiling at the breakfast table. 12 days of taking the empty cup from Daniel every morning and pretending to swallow. 12 days of sitting with Claire and laughing and talking while my stomach was a cold stone. 12 days of watching Daniel and learning, from the outside, what a monster in love's clothing actually looks like. And then Margaret called and said 3 words. We're ready. Move. On a Wednesday morning, while Daniel was at work and Lily was with me, the following things happened simultaneously. Margaret filed for an emergency injunction freezing my trust fund and all joint accounts, citing documented evidence of financial fraud and elder abuse, a designation that applied even though I was only 42, given the nature of the scheme. A separate attorney filed a formal complaint against Dr. I. Marcus Webb with the Oregon Medical Board, including full documentation of the emails discussing my protocol and copies of the fraudulent prescriptions and diagnoses. A private investigator we'd hired on Margaret's recommendation delivered a complete evidence package to the Portland Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. And at 10:17 in the morning, 2 detectives knocked on the door of Daniel's office. I know the timing because Lily was watching a live location share on Daniel's phone, which I had quietly installed access to 5 days prior with Margaret's guidance. We watched the small blue dot go still for over an hour. I was sitting in my kitchen drinking real coffee. The good kind, the kind I realized I'd stopped making, because Daniel always made the coffee, and the coffee, I now understood, was part of how he administered certain things. And I was shaking slightly, but not from fear, from release. Claire was arrested the following day. I had thought I would feel satisfaction about that. Instead, I felt a grief so specific and heavy that it had its own weight, its own texture. 20 years. 20 years of real friendship, real laughter, real love, and somewhere in the middle of it, something had gone wrong in her, or in the world around her, or in the seams between the two. I don't know what Daniel offered her. I don't know if he held something over her. I may never know. What I know is that she made a choice. Whatever led to it, she made a choice. And so did I. Dr. Webb's license was suspended pending investigation within the same week. Within a month, 3 additional former patients had come forward. The elderly woman Margaret had mentioned. A man in his 50s. A woman just a few years older than me. There were more. There are always more when someone like Webb has been operating unchecked for years. When they've learned how to do it quietly, in the language of care. As for Daniel, he hired a lawyer immediately. He was released on bail. The legal process, as anyone who has been through it will tell you, is slow and impersonal and frequently maddening. But Margaret was confident. The evidence was overwhelming, and the emails were damning in a way that left very little room for interpretation. She cannot know what she's taking. Achievable, but requires consistent administration. 6 to 8 weeks, Claire. Some things once said cannot be unsaid. I changed the locks 2 days after Daniel's arrest. when I sat in my living room with Lily and ordered pizza and watched a movie I'd been wanting to watch for months. At some point, Lily fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, the way she used to when she was small. I sat there in the quiet of my own house, which felt entirely different now, lighter somehow, even though nothing had physically changed. And I let myself feel it, all of it. The anger and the grief and the strange, bewildered relief of a woman who has been handed her life back after someone else tried to file it away. People ask me when I tell this story what the hardest part was. They expect me to say the discovery, the laptop, the folder, the emails, the moment of finding out. But that wasn't the hardest part. The hardest part was the morning after I found the laptop, before any of the investigation, before Lily, before Margaret, when Daniel brought me my morning medication in the little white cup, and I took it from his hands and said thank you, and he kissed my forehead, and I tucked it under my tongue and thought, this man has never loved me the way I loved him. And I had to stand in the bathroom, pill dissolving under cold water in the sink, and grieve something that never existed. Grieve the marriage that wasn't. Grieve the years I'd given to a lie. Grieve the version of myself that had been so thoroughly deceived, and then straighten up. Dry my face. Walk back out into the kitchen and smile. That was the hardest part. Not the finding out. The carrying it. The choosing every single morning for 12 days to carry it alone and keep moving and build something instead of falling apart. That's not strength born from being fearless. It's strength born from being more afraid of what happens if you stop than what happens if you keep going. I think a lot about what makes someone do this. Not the mechanics, the emails and the shell companies and the medication. All of that I understand now in every clinical detail. I mean the interior of it. What does a person look like? From the inside, who can sit across from someone they've destroyed and perform tenderness? Who can watch a woman crumble under the weight of a manufactured illness and feel, what? Satisfaction? Nothing? I genuinely don't know. Daniel, to this day, does not appear to feel guilt. His attorney's strategy is centered on arguing that I misinterpreted the emails, that Dr. Webb acted unilaterally, that Daniel was a devoted husband who was managing a difficult situation the best he could. Even the emails say otherwise. The 3 additional victims of Dr. Webb say otherwise. The shell company says otherwise. And the folder labeled Sarah, archived, says it louder than anything else. Because archived is not a word you use for a person, it's a word you use for something you're done with, something you're storing away because it no longer serves a purpose. He never saw a wife when he looked at me. He saw an account. Here is what I want to leave you with. I am 42 years old. I live in my house that I own outright now, with the trust fund fully restored and legally protected. I have a daughter in Boston who calls me every other day and is going to make a terrifying attorney someday. I have coffee in the morning, the good kind, made exactly the way I like it. I have my mind back, all of it. The clarity, the sharpness, the memory I had been convinced was dissolving. It's all here. It never left. It was taken, temporarily, by people who believed that a woman alone and grieving was easy to erase. They were almost right. Almost. There's something nobody tells you about gaslighting. Real, sustained, systematic gaslighting. They don't tell you that surviving it changes the architecture of your trust, that you emerge from it knowing, in a way you can't unknow, that the people closest to you have the greatest capacity to destroy you, not because everyone will, but because the proximity is real, the access is real. What you do with that knowledge is up to you. I chose not to let it make me smaller. I chose not to let it make me cold. I'm still someone who falls in love with ranunculus flowers on a kitchen table. I'm still someone who cries at the end of a good movie. I'm still someone who answers the phone on the second ring for the people she loves. I just know the difference now between love and performance. I know that love doesn't hand you your medication and watch you swallow. Love doesn't archive you. Some people don't just leave you. They try to erase you. The difference between them succeeding and failing? You, always, irreducibly, stubbornly. You. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings moved through the courts with the grinding patience of institutional justice. Daniel was formally charged with financial fraud, elder abuse under Oregon statute, and conspiracy to commit medical malpractice. Doctor, on web-faced criminal charges in addition to the permanent revocation of his medical license. The investigation into his practice uncovered evidence of a broader pattern spanning at least 4 additional patients, one of whom had been institutionalized, and, upon re-examination by independent physicians, showed no evidence of the cognitive decline she'd been diagnosed with. She was 71 years old. She had lost 3 years of her life. Claire cooperated with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced charge. I don't know where she is now. I don't follow it closely enough to find out. There is a version of me that could move toward forgiveness eventually. A distant version, far down the road. But I'm not there yet. And I've learned not to rush myself toward emotional states I don't genuinely feel yet. That was one of the things therapy, real therapy, with a therapist I found myself, whose credentials I verified, whose office I drove to alone, taught me. You don't perform healing. You don't archive grief to appear functional. You stay in the room with the feeling until you understand it well enough to carry it. Dr. Ann Reeves, my original therapist, the one whose recordings I'd found on that laptop, was not complicit. She was, as I discovered, also a victim. She had no idea her sessions were being recorded. When Margaret brought her in to view the evidence, she was devastated in a way that could only be genuine. She became one of the most powerful witnesses for the prosecution. My trust fund is intact. My competency has never been formally questioned. The evaluation Daniel had scheduled was canceled the day of his arrest, and the emergency injunction ensured there were no financial maneuvers made in the window between his arrest and the court order. I still live in the colonial house on the quiet street. I thought about selling it. I still think about it sometimes. But this house is full of 18 years of Lily's childhood, and the wall in the hallway that she marked every birthday, and the garden my mother helped me plant the summer before she got sick. I'm not letting someone's evil live in the walls of my house. I'm letting my life live there instead. Lily graduated from her junior year at the top of her class. She came home for the summer and slept in her old room, and we fell back into a version of the old routine. Coffee at 7, walks in the afternoon, cooking on Sundays, but different. Quieter in a way that felt chosen rather than inherited. One evening, sitting on the back porch watching the light go gold over the yard, she said, "Mom, how did you do it? How did you go those 12 days pretending nothing was wrong?" I thought about it for a moment, the way you think about something you've lived rather than studied. I kept thinking, I said, about who I was before all of it started. Before the fog and the medication and the appointments and the doubt, I kept thinking about her, that woman. And I thought, she deserves to still exist. She deserves to come out the other side of this. Lily looked at me for a long moment. She did, she said simply. And we sat in the gold light together, my daughter and I, and said nothing else. Because there was nothing else to say. Sometimes, before I sleep, I think about that folder, the name he gave me when I'd served my purpose, the label on a container he believed would hold me permanently. Here's what I know about archives. They're static. They're finished. They're for things that don't change anymore. I am none of those things. I am 42 years old and I know who I am and what I'm worth and exactly how sharp my mind is on a Tuesday morning with good coffee and the right medication, which is none, by the way. None at all. I am not archived. I am not done. I am exactly, precisely, and unmistakably here. And some people, I think as I close my eyes, some people genuinely miscalculate how hard a woman will fight for her own existence. That mistake is always theirs to live with, never hers.